Hi, hello, welcome back to this channel. My name is Tian Tian. If this is your first time here, I am a product designer based here in Atlanta, Georgia. And today in this video, we're going to take a look at one of my old projects. Have you ever looked at an old project that you worked on? You're like, wow, I can't believe that I did that a long time ago. Or wow, I can't believe I used to do things this way. Well, today I'm going to look at one of my old projects that I did a long time ago. It's actually my old bootcamp project. So I am also I guess you could say like bootcamp grad, or went through that system and that process. And this is the project that ended up coming out of that bootcamp. And I opened up the file a little bit ago. I was just looking through it and was thinking, how much has changed on how I think, how I approach problems, how I think about design. And I just wanted to give some insight and just look into how things have changed from then and what they look like, or how I think about things now. So let's get into Figma. All right, here we are in the very old Hithat file. So like I said, this project is my old bootcamp project. Some context around it. This was basically a mobile app that helped people who have food allergies search and find restaurants that they can feel safe to eat at. And this is that project. I think what I'm just gonna do is go down all the different pages, talk a little bit about just the overall, like what I see as I navigate through it, and give some insight into how I would probably approach things very differently. So first of all, one of the first things that I've already noticed is the way I've organized this file. So if you see here, this says wireframes, hi-fi, components, brand identity, assets. When I work in files now, my files are not as broken down like wireframes, Hi-Fidelity, components, brand identity. Some of these pieces here are like pages that I would have in my file, but really when you're creating a file for people to look at, especially when you're working on teams and when you're looking in a company, you want to organize it in a way so that everything is organized and that the different people you're working with and collaborating with can navigate through it easily. So for example, for me, I'll put something up here to show kind of an example of how organized files. So I'll usually have like a final design file, which is where usually like product managers and developers will go look at that page to see like the final designs for something. I'll have like an explorations page of all the just out of box thinking, and then some archive page, maybe like a prototype page, and then a document area for like a TLDR or like a notes area, so that if people need more context around the problem, they can go to that page to look at it to understand that a little bit more. So yeah, sometimes I'll have a components page depending on how like extensive or how many new components that I have. But a lot of the times I won't really have a components page, just because a lot of the components that I'm using are from my team's library. So there's that. But let's just jump into this first page, wireframe. So what really is interesting about this is I don't do wireframes like this anymore. Especially these low fidelity wireframes. Me in particular, what I've realized is that when I want to get something out of my mind and I really want just something very low fidelity, not a lot of detail, I will default to pen and paper, pencil and paper, whatever, paper and some type of writing utensil. I have found that like this kind of low fidelity with all the gray squares and boxes and all that stuff, there's still a lot of work and time and effort that goes into putting these together in this way. And I've noticed that since the evolution and introduction of design systems, I feel like whenever I'm putting together an idea or trying to put something together very quickly, just so I can get my ideas out, I will default to design systems, because you already have these pre-made components. You can just take them and think about the different ways the different pieces will interact together so that your ideas can come to life. And I just don't do this anymore. This is a lot of work. There's a lot of detail too. Like you have this to try and show like an icon or imagery. You have text here. I don't know, for something that's supposed to be low fidelity, something that's not supposed, it's really supposed to just convey like the overall layout and how information flows. I don't know. Call me lazy or whatever you want to call it. Just this seems like a lot of effort for you to go through just to get very high level ideas out. So I don't really approach this as much with the grayscale kind of esque thing. I mean, if you wanted to, hypothetically, you could start, if you don't want people to get distracted by like the colors and the typography and all that stuff, you could create a hypothetically low fidelity design system to build out the things that you want to build out quickly. And pretty sure there's a ton of that kind of stuff in like the Figma community, so you can go check that out, see what floats your boat. Pen and paper girl over here still think that's really valuable to my process. So this page just wouldn't exist. It just wouldn't exist. All right, high fidelity page. Now this is my high fidelity page. And I think what's so interesting is that the way that this like file is organized and the way that everything is put together has that like Bootcamp-esque vibe, and that this is how your project broke down. Like you started with your low fidelity, you went to your mid fidelities, and you went to your high fidelities, and then I had some like other, like this is you putting your brand identity together. These are the, I don't know, the UI pieces that you had to put together. So that's something that I think it's just really like, you know, nostalgic, going back to seeing like, oh, this is how, you know, the way you're learning is a reflection of like how you put things together. So, which makes a lot of sense. But here for the high fidelity page, so this would probably, if I were to be working at like a file at work or something, this would probably be like final designs. And the way I have all of this organized though is very unclear, meaning I am the only person probably who could look at this and really truly understand what's going on. If another designer were to look into this, I mean, you know, there'd probably be a lot of questions asked. Some of the ways that I have just these different flows put together is it's again very unclear. If I were working out of if I were to do this part again, there would be a lot more notes, and there'd be a lot more like arrows pointing at things to explain, like if this, you go here, this thing happens. If you click here, this thing happens. Usually I have like labels to show like the different flows that I'm working on. Also, something else that is really interesting is that the concept of an MVP. So when I was working through this project, I don't know if I really truly understood what an MVP was. And so as I'm looking through all of these different like flows and how everything's put together and what is actually possible to build, I feel like, first of all, this onboarding project here would probably be its own project in and of itself. Filtering would definitely be a project in and of itself. Sorting through reviews, probably another like filtering-esque project. Leaving a review, definitely its own project. So I feel like a lot of these pieces, you know, you put them together and they actually create like a fully functioning MVP app, sure. But then when I'm thinking about the different ways that we like build products, these would probably all be their own epics, most likely. And so realistically speaking, all of these would probably have their own file. They wouldn't just be in this one large file that I have here. It would definitely be broken down some more, lots more notes, you'd have to get into really the details of like the micro interactions, all of the happy paths, error paths, warning paths, all of these different things of like, if someone clicked this and it did not compute, what is the information that is presented to the user here? It can't all be, and that's another thing here. It's like going through this, and as I'm looking at it, a lot of the ways that I've set up these, like laid out these designs and put all these screens together, don't really account for all the different paths and states and things that like you need to think about as you're going through creating these different flows and then different interfaces to convey the different ways that your user will interact with your application. So this has been a really, it's amazing how different it is. And maybe one day I'll share like an old project file for work. I don't know honestly how comfortable I would be with that, because I don't know, it's like information privacy, NDA stuff. I have to think about it. Anyway, so that's definitely this is very different to how I would present and hand off and just have this page for if I were to be working in a work environment. Like I said, previous components page. Also, okay, this is something that I think is actually very interesting. So if you are a Figma OG person, so you worked with Figma a long time ago, and the evolution of Figma has been amazing. But anywho, that's a whole other thing for a whole other day. But here we have, if you remember, to group components or pieces together, you have to use the backslash to convey like, oh, this is actually grouped with this. It's amazing how much it has changed, but yeah, that's how old this file is. And when I saw this, I was like, holy ish, I have not seen this in a long time. I have not done this in a very long time, but it's really, really cool to see how much has changed and how much has evolved since the OG days. So this is my components page. Definitely it would be so different. Well, I think I only created the things that I really thought I needed, which makes a lot of sense because this project is only me working on it. But the way I have this organized, I don't know, it's really not honestly that different. The only thing I think would be different was just the way I named things to convey like the different states of, the different components that I have here. I think there's a lot of more naming conventions that I didn't really understand or know existed back then. And then of course I would probably update this to the new standards that Figma has in their design systems, and how I would organize, like create different pages for different components depending on if there's like a lot of them. So I like, hypothetically speaking, like I have only 3 buttons here, but realistically speaking, it's probably not the case in this. So this was definitely a great introduction into just thinking about pieces and components and how things are reusable as you're designing, especially when you're working on a bootcamp project. It's sometimes hard to think about how these pieces are going to be reused, not only in just your project, but like if you're working on a team, all these pieces are going to be used across your team because everyone's working on this greater product. And when your users are going from one part of the product to the other part of the product, there needs to be consistency and like cohesion across the two experiences because you're technically in the same ecosystem. So I think this was helpful. This was very helpful, but definitely would still do it very differently. Brand identity. So this was interesting in that I don't think that I would make any kind of page like this really anymore. I haven't done this since ever really in a long time. The closest thing I think is like design systems like documentation possibly, and this is a little bit of like what that is, talking about color palettes, typography, but this is very high level. This is not really, that level of documentation of like how things work, interact, and how things can be used, sort of getting into the documentation around like style guides of like elements, but it doesn't really give you very much. So this whole brand identity, I mean, I make my own app from the beginning, so I could pretty much do anything I wanted, but I think this is a good start to have to get the footing so that if anyone else were to ever use this, they could get an idea of like, oh, this is how you would set up. This is kind of the font family, like the family, and then the hierarchy that's used and some of the different color scales that I have. And I'm actually surprised that I had different color scale. Like I at least had like a dark and a light version of the different colors that I use, which I'm pretty okay. I would definitely have a lot more colors to choose from, and the different like colors that I would have if I were to rethink my color system again. Speaking of colors here, I'd probably pick a better color in that this is, the contrast here is actually like really hard. So like, it's really hard to see. I thought it was a great, I like light blue. I still like light blue, but we know that you can't just pick a color just because you like it. It's not really a great reasoning, but that was my reasoning. So here we are. And then the last page I have here is the assets page, which, I don't know, this was just me creating assets for, I think, my case study. So it's just, you know, using this as like Illustrator, Photoshop. This is kind of hodgepodge. This probably be like, I just had this in this file. And again, this is very reflective of like, this is a bootcamp project. So like I had to come up with a case study and put the case study together. And this is why I have an assets page like this. You might have an assets page if you need it. I think assets would probably be in combination with like components probably, maybe. I don't know. I haven't had one of these pages in a long time. So that was my old project Hi-Hat. Let me know if you want to see a more in-depth process, more process-driven video around how I went through this project during the bootcamp and how I would have probably approached it differently. What are some of the similarities that I would still continue to practice, and what are the differences? I think going through just the file structure and just like how things were laid out, how things are organized, and how things are presented, just a really great reflection of like, and just, you know, thinking about how much has changed since then versus now, and the way my process has changed from then versus now. If you want to also check out the old portfolio case study that I did, I'll link that below and you can just kind of read over it. And then that will probably give some insight into like a more, into the process of actually going through the whole like project. And then, you know, maybe I'll do a video on that. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.